Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today
Goody.
into a topic that you all specifically requested,
Oh, wow.
which is mental models and how they can help you make better decisions,
Okay,
especially when you are under pressure.
that's great.
And, we have some pretty cool material to work with.
Yeah, we do.
So we've got this book,
Okay.
Mental Models, The Thinking Tools of History's Greatest Problem Solvers,
Wow.
which is going to give us a great foundation.
Okay.
But then we're going to explore the work of Radek Osika,
Okay.
who is a heart coach who specializes in decision-making under stress.
Interesting.
His workshop is called Efektywnie ratowanie w stresu,
Okay.
which basically means effective decision-making under stress.
Okay.
We're going to be using a bunch of his material, like his website and YouTube videos,
Right.
and maybe even some audio if we can find it,
Okay.
to bring his ideas to life for you guys.
Yeah, I think what's really going to resonate with the listeners is how Radek combines this understanding of mental models with practical techniques to navigate stress
Absolutely.
and make clearer choices.
For sure. So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly are mental models?
Well, think of them as frameworks for understanding how the world works.
Okay,
They're like mental shortcuts to help us simplify complex situations
gotcha.
and make sense of the information overload that we face every day.
Okay, so instead of getting bogged down in every detail, mental models can help us focus
Yes.
on what's important.
Exactly. Our source on mental models actually describes them as
Oh, cool.
the thinking tools of history's greatest problem solvers
I like that.
because they help us see the bigger picture, avoid common errors,
Yeah.
and ultimately make better decisions.
I can already see how this is going to be super relevant to our listener
Yeah.
who specifically requested this topic,
Right.
because they're interested in improving their decision-making skills.
Absolutely. And, one of the key themes that Radek explores in his workshop is this idea of making good decisions when we're under stress,
Oh, yeah.
which I think we can all relate to.
Oh, for sure. Stress can totally derail our decision-making abilities. It's like
Yeah.
our brain goes into freeze mode.
Yeah.
But Rydek seems to have some really interesting ideas about how to overcome that.
Yes, he does. And one of the core concepts he emphasizes is this power of achieving
Okay.
what we call a flow state when it comes to decision making.
Now, I've heard of flow state before,
Yeah.
but I'm not totally clear on how it applies to making decisions.
Okay, so Radek draws on the work of psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi,
Okay.
who is really the pioneer of flow state research.
Okay.
And essentially, flow is that state of being completely absorbed in an activity where you kind of lose track of time and effort.
Okay.
It's that feeling of being in the zone.
Okay, I think I get it. Like when you're so engrossed in a project
Yes,
that you completely forget about everything else going on around you.
exactly.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that when we're in this flow state, our intuition kicks in,
Okay.
and we often make better, more effortless decisions.
So how does this tie into decision-making under stress?
Well, Radek argues that by learning to access this flow state,
Okay.
we can essentially bypass the negative effects of stress
Wow.
and tap into a more intuitive, clear-headed way of making choices.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
I'm already starting to see how these ideas could be like total game changers
Yeah.
for our listeners. But before we get too deep into the how-to,
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge that stress isn't the only thing
Yeah.
that gets in the way of making good decisions.
Absolutely. You're right. Radek highlights several other enemies
Okay.
of effective decision-making that we need to be aware of.
Okay, spill the tea. What are these enemies?
Well, he argues that sometimes our biggest obstacle is ourselves.
Oh,
Specifically, our ego and our comfort zone
okay.
can really hold us back.
I can see how clinging to our comfort zone would prevent us from taking risks
Mhm.
or making those tough choices.
Yeah.
That might actually lead to better outcomes.
Yes.
But what does he say about the ego?
Well, Radek points out that our ego often wants to protect us from discomfort
Yeah.
or failure.
Yeah.
So it keeps us stuck in those familiar patterns,
Yeah.
even if they're not serving us.
Yeah.
It's that voice in our head that says,
Oh, yeah.
don't try, that you might fail, or stick with what, it's safer.
It's like that saying, like, better the devil,
Right.
But sometimes we need to embrace a little uncertainty to grow and make progress.
Absolutely. And Radek also highlights another common obstacle,
Okay.
limiting beliefs.
Oh, those sneaky little gremlins. I think we all have those,
Yeah.
those negative beliefs about ourselves that can really sabotage our decision making.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Roddick gives some really relatable examples in his materials.
Like what?
Like things like, I'm not good enough,
Okay, yeah.
or people can't be trusted,
Mm.
or I'll never be successful.
Yeah. Those are all too familiar. I can see how those beliefs would definitely
Yeah.
lead to self-sabotaging decisions.
Exactly.
Uh,
For example, if you believe you're not good enough,
yeah,
you might not even try for that promotion or apply for that dream job.
right.
You might settle for less because you don't believe you deserve more.
So awareness of these limiting beliefs is the first step to overcoming them.
Precisely.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's the impact of our environment
Oh, yeah.
and the people around us.
You mean like peer pressure and social expectations?
Yeah,
I feel like those can be super powerful even as adults.
absolutely. Raddick talks about the dangers of groupthink,
Oh, yeah.
where we make decisions based on what the group wants or what we think is expected of us,
Right.
even if it goes against our own better judgment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if all your friends are investing in a certain stock,
Right,
you might feel pressure to do the same even if you have doubts about it.
exactly. And even our physical environment can play a role. If you're constantly surrounded by clutter and chaos, it can be harder to focus and make clear decisions.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got these three major obstacles
Yeah.
to effective decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Ourselves, our ego and comfort zone,
Right.
our limiting beliefs, and our
Yes.
environment.
Yeah,
It's starting to feel a little overwhelming,
it can.
but I'm hoping that Raddick offers some solutions to overcome these challenges.
He does.
Okay, good.
And they're surprisingly practical and insightful.
Okay.
He lays out this roadmap with specific steps
Okay.
for managing emotions,
Mm-hmm.
defining a clear vision,
Okay.
overcoming limiting beliefs,
Yes.
and even dealing with those inevitable walls we hit in life.
Okay. I'm definitely ready to hear more about that.
Yeah.
Let's start with emotions.
Okay.
What does he say about managing those, especially when we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed?
Well, Raddick's approach is all about understanding how emotions work and learning to work with them rather than trying to suppress them or control them.
Okay, that makes sense. I've definitely tried to ignore or push down my emotions in the past, and it never really works out well.
Doesn't work.
So what does he suggest?
He actually introduces this 5-step process
Okay.
for working with emotions in a healthy way.
I'm all ears.
Right.
What are the 5 steps?
The first step is body awareness.
Okay.
It's all about tuning into the physical sensations that accompany emotions.
So like noticing that you have a tight chest when you're anxious?
Yeah.
Or like a knot in your stomach when you're nervous?
Exactly. The second step is identification.
Okay.
So once you've noticed the physical sensation, you can start to identify the emotion
Right.
that's linked to it.
So in that anxiety example, you might realize, okay, I'm feeling anxious right now.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then comes the crucial step of naming it.
Okay.
Radix says that by actually saying the name of the emotion out loud or to yourself,
Okay.
you take away some of its power.
Interesting. So I might say I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling stressed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fourth step is acceptance.
Okay.
This is about acknowledging the emotion without judgment.
Okay.
It's about saying, yes, I'm feeling this, and that's okay.
I love that. It's about allowing ourselves to feel our emotions fully
Yeah.
without trying to resist them.
And then the final step is release.
Okay.
Radix suggests visualizing the emotion leaving your body,
Okay.
like a balloon floating away or simply
Mhm.
breathing it out.
That whole process feels very mindful
Yeah.
and almost meditative.
It is. And Raddick even shares a powerful anecdote about how emotions
Okay.
are like layers of an onion.
Oh, wow.
By working through each layer, we can get to the core
Okay.
of what's driving our feelings and behaviors.
Okay, that's such a great visual. I can see how that would really resonate with people.
Yeah.
So we've talked about understanding and managing emotions.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step in Raddick's roadmap to better decisions?
It's all about defining your vision.
Yeah.
Raddick argues that having a clear vision for the future is crucial
Okay.
for making good decisions in the present.
I like that, because if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
Exactly.
Right.
And he ties this back to the source material by quoting Tony Robbins,
Oh, cool.
who said,
Okay.
"A clear vision without decisions is just a dream, but decisions without a vision is chaos."
That's a powerful quote.
Yeah.
I can definitely see how that would be memorable
Yeah.
for our listeners.
And this step is all about overcoming those negative emotions we talked about earlier
Okay.
and making choices that are aligned with our goals.
Gotcha.
When we have a strong vision,
Yeah.
we're more likely to push through those feelings of fear and doubt and make decisions that move us closer to our desired future, our desired
Yes.
outcome.
I love that.
Yeah,
It's like having that North Star to guide you even when the seas get stormy.
I love that analogy.
Thanks.
So we've got our emotions in check, and we've got our vision locked in. What's next on Radek's roadmap?
Well, we can't forget about those sneaky limiting beliefs we talked about earlier. They can be real roadblocks to making effective decisions.
Absolutely. Radek has a 3-step process for tackling those limiting beliefs head-on.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me the tools to break free from those mental chains.
The first step is all about awareness. We need to shine a light on those negative beliefs that are lurking in the shadows of our minds and holding us back. Radek actually uses a really clever story to illustrate this point. It's the story of fleas in a jar.
Oh, I've heard that one. It's about how the fleas are trained to jump only so high in the jar, and even when the lid is removed, they continue to limit themselves based on that previous experience.
Exactly. It's a powerful metaphor for how our own invisible limitations, those beliefs we've internalized, can keep us from reaching our full potential.
It's like we're putting an artificial ceiling on ourselves without even realizing it.
Precisely. So the first step is simply becoming aware of what those limiting beliefs are. What are those negative thoughts that automatically pop into your head when you're faced with a decision or a challenge?
That's a great question for our listener to consider. What are those phrases or sentences that keep replaying in your mind? I'm not good enough. I'll never be able to do that. It's too risky. Those are the limiting beliefs we need to become aware of.
Exactly. Once we shine a light on them, we can start to challenge their validity.
Okay, so awareness is step one. What's the next step in breaking free from these limiting beliefs?
The next step is to consciously replace those negative beliefs with new, empowering beliefs. It's about reframing those old stories we tell ourselves.
So instead of saying, I'm not good enough, I might start affirming I am capable and deserving of success.
Exactly. It's about feeding your mind with positive affirmations and evidence that supports those new beliefs.
It's like we're rewiring our brains for success, replacing those old negative circuits with new positive ones.
Precisely. And the final step is to align your behavior with those new beliefs. If you believe you're capable, you start taking actions that reflect that belief. You step outside your comfort zone, you take on new challenges, you go for those opportunities that you previously would have avoided.
It's about putting those new beliefs into practice and proving to yourself that they're true.
Exactly. And this shift in our beliefs directly impacts our decision-making. When we shed those limiting beliefs, we open ourselves up to new possibilities and make choices that are aligned with our true potential.
This is so empowering. I can already feel a shift in my own thinking just by talking about this. It's like a weight has been lifted, but I know life isn't always smooth sailing. What does Radek say about dealing with those inevitable setbacks and challenges that we all face? We all hit those walls sometimes.
He does. He acknowledges that setbacks are a part of life. In fact, he introduces this concept of the wall, which represents that feeling of hitting a wall and wanting to give up when things get tough.
Oh, I think we've all been there. It's that moment where you feel like throwing in the towel, like all your effort has been for nothing.
Exactly. It's that point where we feel overwhelmed, discouraged, and tempted to give up on our goals. And Radek has a really insightful strategy for pushing through those tough times. He highlights the work of Yaroslav Pish, who outlines 4 steps for overcoming the wall.
Okay, I'm ready to take notes. How do we become wall-crushing machines?
The first step is to redefine yourself. This goes back to challenging those limiting beliefs and recognizing your own resilience. It's about acknowledging that you're stronger than you think you are.
So instead of seeing ourselves as failures when we hit a setback, we need to remind ourselves of our past successes and all the challenges we've already overcome.
Exactly. It's about shifting that internal narrative from I'm a failure to I am a resilient problem solver who can handle this.
Love that. Okay, so redefine yourself. What's the next step?
The second step is to redefine your actions. What new strategies or approaches can you adopt to overcome the challenge? This is about being flexible and adapting to the situation rather than getting stuck in old patterns that aren't working.
So if what we've been doing isn't working, we need to be willing to pivot to try a new approach to get creative.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself, what can I do differently? What resources can I tap into? Who can I ask for help?
Okay, so redefine yourself and redefine your actions. What's next?
The third step is to redefine the world around you. This is about understanding how the situation has changed and what new opportunities or resources might be available. It's about looking at the situation with fresh eyes rather than getting bogged down in the old narrative.
So instead of dwelling on how unfair or difficult the situation is, we need to look for the potential solutions or opportunities that might be hidden within the challenge.
Exactly. And this might involve researching new information, seeking advice from experts, or simply shifting your perspective.
Got it. Redefine yourself, redefine your actions, redefine the world. What's the final step in overcoming the wall?
The final step is to redefine your future. This is about adjusting your vision if necessary and reaffirming your commitment to your goals.
So even if we've experienced a setback, we don't give up on our dreams. We simply adjust our course, our timeline, or even our expectations, but we keep moving forward.
Precisely. It's about remembering why you started this journey in the first place and reminding yourself that setbacks are temporary, but your determination is what will ultimately lead you to success.
This is a really powerful framework for dealing with challenges. It's about turning setbacks into opportunities for growth and transformation. And it reminds me that even when we hit that wall, we have the power to choose how we respond. We can choose to give up, or we can choose to rise above the challenge and come back stronger than ever.
Absolutely. And Roddick emphasizes that this strategy is especially valuable for navigating those major life disruptions, those big, unexpected events that can really shake us to our core.
This is such valuable advice. It applies to everything from career setbacks and financial challenges to relationship issues and health crises. It's a reminder that we have the inner strength to overcome anything life throws our way.
Exactly. And on top of these big picture strategies for managing emotions, defining our vision, overcoming limiting beliefs, and navigating what, the Walradic also offers some really practical tips for making better decisions in our everyday lives.
Okay, I'm all about actionable advice. Hit me with those bonus tips. What are some simple things we can do to improve our decision-making in those day-to-day situations?
Well, first he talks about the importance of creating your ideal decision-making environment.
So finding a quiet space where you can think clearly without distractions?
Exactly. It's about minimizing the impact of those external pressures and internal distractions that can cloud our judgment.
It's so easy to let those external pressures and internal distractions, like, totally cloud our judgment.
Oh, for sure.
So creating that space where you can actually just think clearly is so important.
Yeah, and it's much easier to make those sound decisions
Right.
when you're in a calm, focused state of mind.
Absolutely. So create that space for yourself where
Yeah.
you can truly think things through.
Yeah, I love that.
Oh.
What else does he recommend?
Well, he also suggests that you should develop personal rules
Okay.
or guidelines
Uh-huh.
to help you make consistent,
Yeah.
values-aligned decisions.
So it's like having your own personal code of conduct.
Yes, exactly, for making choices.
I love that.
And he uses this really cute analogy
Oh,
to
yeah.
illustrate this.
What is it?
It's the analogy of the vineyard stake
Okay.
that supports a grapevine.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's a nod to his experience as a winemaker.
Right.
And it's such a beautiful way to visualize how those personal rules can provide us with structure and support
Absolutely.
as we navigate all the complexities of life.
It's a beautiful image. So these rules could be anything,
Yeah.
from like consulting with your partner on financial decisions.
Yeah, or taking like a 24-hour cooling off period
Oh, yeah.
before you make any big purchases.
Absolutely.
Or even something as simple as like, I don't check email first thing in the morning,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. It's about identifying what principles are most important to you
Yes.
and creating those guidelines that
Right.
will help you make choices that align
Yes.
with your values and your goals.
What a great way to just create that consistency and,
Absolutely.
and intentionality in our decision making.
I love it.
Okay, what other gems does Radek offer?
He recommends a very simple but powerful acronym to help you check in with your emotional state
Okay.
before making a decision. It's called HALT.
HAL.
Yes.
Okay, tell me more.
HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired.
Oh,
Yeah.
so it's like a reminder to pause before making a decision
Yes.
and ask yourself if you're experiencing any of these negative states.
Exactly. Because when we're feeling any of those emotions,
Yeah.
we're more likely to make impulsive or reactive decisions
Yeah.
that we might later regret.
That's so true. It's
Wow.
about recognizing that our emotional state
Yeah.
can have a huge impact
Oh, yeah.
on our decision-making abilities.
It can hijack our decision-making.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
So before you make that choice,
Yeah.
check in with yourself.
Yes.
Are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired?
Exactly.
If so, address those needs first
Yeah.
before making a decision.
Such a simple but powerful tool.
I love it. And it's so easy to remember.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, what else?
And finally, Radek emphasizes the importance of considering the timing and impact of your decisions.
Because some decisions require quick thinking,
Yes.
while others need more careful deliberation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He suggests trusting your gut
Okay.
and making a quick decision
Okay.
when the stakes are low.
Gotcha.
But for those high-stakes choices, it's worth gathering more information,
Yeah.
considering different perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
and taking the time to weigh your options carefully.
That makes perfect sense. It's about being strategic and
Yeah.
discerning
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to our decision making.
Absolutely. And recognizing that not all decisions
Mm-hmm.
are created equal.
They're not.
Some
Yeah.
require more
Yeah.
thoughtful deliberation than others.
Well, this has been an incredible
It has.
deep dive into mental models and decision making.
Yeah, it's been amazing.
I feel like we've uncovered
So many.
a treasure trove
Yeah.
of wisdom and practical strategies.
I think what's so exciting is that these concepts and tools
Yeah.
are readily available to everyone. You know, it's not about having some special talent or gift for decision-making.
Right.
It's about learning and applying these strategies to enhance
Yes.
our natural abilities.
I love how Radek blends this understanding of psychology
Yes.
with those practical, actionable steps
Mm-hmm.
that we can all take to improve our decision making.
I agree. And I think one of the key takeaways here is the importance of awareness.
Absolutely.
Whether it's becoming aware of our emotions, our limiting beliefs,
Yeah.
or the influences of our environment,
Yeah,
that awareness is the first step
it is.
to making more conscious and intentional choices.
Remember that analogy of shining a light
Yes,
on those limiting beliefs that are lurking in the shadows?
absolutely.
It's about bringing them into our conscious awareness.
Yeah.
So we can start to challenge them
Yes.
and transform them.
So thinking back on our discussion about limiting beliefs
Mm-hmm.
and Radek's flea in a jar story,
Mm-hmm.
what's one limiting belief that you've been holding on to
Oh.
that you're now ready to challenge?
That is a great question for all of us to consider.
Yeah.
What's that one belief that keeps popping up for you
Mm-hmm.
and holding you back?
Yeah.
Take a moment to reflect on that. What could you achieve
Yeah.
if you actually let go of that limiting belief?
Such a powerful question
It is.
for everyone listening.
And once we identify those limiting beliefs,
Yes.
we can start to replace them
Absolutely.
with those empowering beliefs that will fuel our growth and success.
Yes. And we can't forget about those practical tips for navigating those inevitable challenges and setbacks.
Oh, they're coming.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of happen.
They are a part of life.
Remember Roddick's concept of the wall
Oh, yes.
and Yaroslav Pisha's 4 steps for overcoming it?
Such a powerful framework
Yes.
for dealing with those moments.
It's a reminder that we have the inner strength to redefine ourselves, our actions,
Yes.
the world around us, and even our vision for the future.
Love it.
We can choose resilience over resignation. And we can emerge from those challenges stronger and wiser.
Yes. And those bonus tips that Radek offered are pure gold.
Yeah, they are.
Creating an ideal decision-making environment, establishing personal rules
Yeah.
or guidelines, using the HLS system to check in with our emotional state,
Mm-hmm.
and considering the timing and impact of our decisions.
Yes.
These are all simple but profound strategies.
I love how he brought in that personal touch
Yeah.
with the analogy of the vineyard stake supporting the vine.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful reminder that we can create our own support system,
Yes.
our own set of principles and practices
Yeah.
to help us navigate the complexities of life
Absolutely.
and make choices that are aligned with our values.
It speaks to the power of intentionality.
Yes.
We can create those structures and systems in our lives
Yes.
that support our growth and well-being.
I love that. So it's about taking ownership of our choices
Yes.
and creating a life that reflects our deepest values and aspirations.
Beautifully said.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, what personal rule could you implement today to help you make better choices?
That's such a great question for our listeners to reflect on.
It is.
It could be something as simple as committing to a daily meditation practice
Yes.
to cultivate more mindfulness and emotional awareness.
Yeah.
Or maybe setting aside dedicated time each week to review your goals and making sure your decisions are aligned with those aspirations.
Love it. And remember, it's not about striving for perfection.
No.
It's about progress,
Absolutely.
about making small but consistent changes
Yeah.
that will ultimately lead to
Yes.
bigger
Those
transformations.
bigger transformations in our lives.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose.
View.
We have the power to shape our future through the decisions we make.
Yes.
Every single day. So choose wisely, choose courageously,
Yes.
and choose with heart.
Beautifully said.
And for our listeners who want to dive deeper into Radek's work
Yes.
and explore those resources that we've mentioned today, be sure to check out the show notes for all the links and information.
It's been an absolute pleasure diving deep with you today.
Likewise, until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep making those awesome decisions.